The Long Way Round, The Impossible Race of 1908. Prologue, The Madness of Machines. If you were to stand in the center of a crowded saloon in 1907 and suggest that a man could drive an automobile from New York City to Paris, you would have been laughed out of the room. Not because the geography was misunderstood, everyone knew that the Atlantic Ocean stood in the way, but because the automobile itself was seen as a fragile, coughing, sputtering toy of the rich. In 1907, cars were not reliable transportation. They were mechanical nuisances that scared horses, broke down every 20 miles, and exploded with alarming frequency. There were no gas stations. There were no road maps. West of the Mississippi River, there were hardly any roads at all, just wagon ruts left by the pioneers, buffalo trails, and endless stretches of mud, sagebrush, and mountains. And yet, the challenge was issued. It began as a stunt by Le Matin, a French newspaper, and was quickly joined by the New York Times. The route proposed was not a drive to the coast and a boat ride to France. That would be too easy. The route was a testament to the hubris of the Edwardian era. They would drive west. They would leave Times Square, New York, in the dead of winter. They would drive across the frozen United States to San Francisco. They would ship the cars to Alaska. From there, they would drive across the frozen Bering Strait, literally driving on the ice of the Arctic Ocean, into Siberia. Then they would cross the entirety of the Russian Empire, the wilds of Asia, and the roads of Europe, to finish in Paris. It was a journey of 22,000 miles. It was impossible. It was suicidal. It was the greatest race in history. Chapter 1. The Canyon of Broadway. February 12, 1908. Times Square, New York City. The air smelled of horse manure, unburned gasoline, and the nervous sweat of 250,000 people. New York City had ground to a halt. It was Lincoln's birthday, a holiday, and it seemed every soul in the 5 boroughs had packed themselves into the wedge of land where Broadway met 7th Avenue. Men in bowler hats climbed lampposts for a better view. Women in heavy furs leaned out of the windows of the Hotel Astor. The police horses snorted, their breath pluming in the biting February chill, struggling to hold back the surging wall of humanity. In the center of this chaos sat 6 machines. They looked less like cars and more like open-air carriages bolted onto locomotive engines. They had no windshields, they had no heaters, they had no roofs. The drivers sat exposed to the elements, goggles pulled tight over their eyes, wrapped in layers of wool and leather that made them look like deep-sea divers. There were 3 French cars, a Didion Bouton, a motoblock, and a tiny nimble Césaire Naudin. There was one Italian car, the Zust, a terrifyingly loud machine that looked like a tank. There was one German car, the Protos, a heavy military-grade truck of a vehicle, crewed by stern army officers. And then there was the American, the Thomas Flyer. It was a beast of a car, painted a dull gray that would soon be stained with the mud of 3 continents. It was a 1907 Model 35, possessing 4 cylinders and 60 horsepower. It weighed nearly 5,000 pounds when loaded. Flying from its side was the Stars and Stripes. Sitting in the mechanic's seat was a man named George Schuster. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become one of the greatest badasses in American history. George was not a rich playboy. He was a mechanic from Buffalo, New York. He was short, stocky, and possessed a will made of vanadium steel. He was the man you called when things broke, and on this trip, everything was going to break. Next to him was the driver, Montague Roberts, the glamour boy of the racing world, there for the press and the glory of the start. But Schuster was the heart of the machine. He checked the chains on the rear tires. He checked the strapped-down barrels of gasoline. He checked the rifles. Yes, rifles. because they weren't just driving to Paris, they were driving through areas of the American West and Siberian East where bandits and wolves were a legitimate concern. "Start your engines!" the bullhorn bellowed. A roar tore through the canyon of skyscrapers. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of backfires and mechanical grinding that sent pigeons scattering from the rooftops. The crowd screamed, a wave of noise that rivaled the engines. At 11:15 a.m., a gold-plated pistol was fired into the gray sky. The great race had begun. Chapter 2. The White Hell. The romance of the race lasted exactly 20 miles. As the cars left the cobblestones of New York City and headed north along the Hudson River toward Albany, the sky turned a bruised purple and opened up. This wasn't just snow, it was a blizzard of biblical proportions. In 1908, snow removal consisted of a guy with a shovel. There were no plows. The roads, which were dirt tracks to begin with, vanished instantly under 6 inches, then 12, then 2 feet of snow. The Thomas Flyer, leading the pack, slammed into the white wall. The windshieldless design immediately proved to be a torture device. The windshield dropped below zero. Snow encrusted the driver's goggles, forcing them to stop every few minutes to wipe them clean or risk driving blind into a ditch. By the time they reached Hudson, New York, the race wasn't a race anymore. It was an excavation. "Dig!" Schuster yelled, his voice whipped away by the wind. The American team jumped out of the car. The snow was up to their waists. The magnificent 60-horsepower engine was useless if the wheels couldn't touch the ground. They grabbed shovels strapped to the side of the car and began to dig a path for the tires. They drove 10 feet. They got stuck. They dug again. They drove 10 feet. This was the reality of the high-speed race. In the first 24 hours, they covered less distance than a man could walk. The French competitors were faring worse. The tiny Césaire Nardin, the smallest car in the race, broke its differential on a hidden rock buried under the snow. It was dead in the water before it even left New York State. 1 down, 5 to go. The German Protos, heavy and underpowered, was struggling to climb even mild hills. The Italian Zust, driven by the poet and thrill-seeker Antonio Scarfoglio, was sliding dangerously on every turn, its crew singing opera songs to keep their spirits up as they froze to death. But the Americans pressed on. George Schuster had a particular philosophy: keep moving. If you stop, the fluids freeze. If you stop, the morale dies. If you stop, the Germans catch up. They pushed through Syracuse, then Buffalo, Schuster's hometown. The local factory workers came out in droves to cheer on the hometown car. They cleared the roads with horse-drawn plows for a few miles, giving the Thomas Flyer a brief burst of speed. But as they entered the Midwest, the snow turned to something worse: the mud. Chapter 3. The Gumbo of Iowa. It is difficult for a modern American to understand the roads of 1908. The interstate highway system was 50 years in the future. Pavement was a luxury reserved for city centers. The vast middle of America was connected by dirt tracks that turned into gumbo when wet. Iowa gumbo is not just mud. It is a sticky, clay-like substance that acts like industrial glue. It clings to tires, building up layer upon layer until the wheel is jammed solid against the fender. The Thomas Flyer hit Iowa, and the race ground to a crawl. The mud was so deep, the axles were dragging through the muck. The engine roared, overheating as it fought the friction. Schuster came up with a desperate solution. "The railroad tracks," he said, pointing to the parallel lines of steel running alongside the flooded road. Driving a car on railroad tracks is not illegal if there are no cops to stop you, but it is incredibly dangerous. The wheel track of the Thomas Flyer was roughly the same width as the rails, but not exactly. It meant they had to bump along the wooden ties, thump, 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 thump for miles. It rattled the teeth out of their heads. Bolts vibrated loose and fell off. The chassis groaned under the abuse. And there was always the terrifying possibility of a train coming the other way. One afternoon, in the desolate plains of Nebraska, the vibration caused the transmission case to crack. Oil began to hemorrhage from the flyer. Most crews would have quit. There was no mechanic shop for 500 miles. But George Schuster wasn't most crews. He crawled under the car in the freezing mud. He didn't have a spare transmission case. He didn't have aluminum welding equipment. He wiped away the grease, pulled out a tube of shellac and a leather strap, and essentially glued the transmission back together. He waited for it to set, poured the oil back in, and kicked the starter. The engine roared. "Let's go," Schuster grunted. Chapter 4. The Wrong Way to Alaska. While the Americans were fighting mud in the Midwest, the race had turned into a geopolitical drama. The French team in the motoblock gave up in Iowa. They simply couldn't take the punishment. They sold the car and took a train to New York. The Didion was still in the fight, but miles behind. The real threat was the German Protos. The German team was run with military precision by Lieutenant Hans Koppen. They didn't have the best mechanic, but they had discipline. They slept less. They ate while driving. They were relentless. However, the Americans reached San Francisco first. It had taken them 41 days to cross the United States in winter. It was a record. A hero's welcome awaited them. They were paraded down Market Street. Champagne flowed. But there was a problem: the route. The original plan, the insane plan, was to ship the cars to Alaska, drive to the coast, and cross the frozen Bering Strait. The Thomas Flyer was loaded onto a ship and sent north to Valdez, Alaska. When they arrived, George Schuster looked out at the road. There was no road. There was just 12 feet of soft snow, towering glaciers, and impassable ravines. The trail on the map was a sled dog track, barely 2 feet wide. Schuster found a telegraph office and wired the race committee in New York. Route impossible. Cannot drive over mountains. Cannot drive on ocean. Send instructions. The race committee, sitting in warm offices in Manhattan, realized their error. They changed the rules on the fly. Return to Seattle, ship cars to Japan, drive across Japan, then ship to Vladivostok, Russia. The race continues from there. The Americans had to turn around, but this detour cost them weeks. While the Thomas Flyer was bobbing on a boat to Alaska and back, the other teams, the Germans and the Italians, had skipped Alaska entirely and were heading straight for Russia. To compensate, the race committee awarded the Americans a 15-day allowance. If the Thomas Flyer arrived in Paris less than 15 days behind the Germans, the Americans would win. The race was no longer just about speed. It was about math, and it was about to enter the most dangerous landscape on Earth, Siberia. Chapter 5. The Land of No Mercy. Japan was a blur of tiny roads, confused villagers who had never seen an automobile, and bamboo bridges that creaked terrifyingly under the weight of the American iron. But Japan was a paradise compared to what waited across the sea. Vladivostok, Russia, the gateway to Siberia. It was here that the field was leveled. The German Protos, the Italian Zust, and the American Thomas Flyer were the only ones left. The last French car had retired. Siberia in spring is a nightmare. The winter snows melt, turning the entire landscape into a swamp. There were no paved roads. There was the Trans-Siberian Railway track, and there were post roads, which were essentially rivers of mud used by horse carts. George Schuster took one look at the vast, empty horizon of Russia and realized the car needed armor. He stripped off the fenders. He bolted heavy wooden planks to the sides of the car to use as ramps for getting out of mud. He loaded extra carbines and ammunition. They were entering bandit country. The Manchurian border was lawless. Days turned into weeks of grueling labor. The pattern was agonizing. Drive 1 mile, sink into mud up to the axles. Unload the car, jack it up, place the wooden planks under the wheels. Drive 10 feet, sink again. The physical toll was immense. Schuster hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for 3 months. His hands were permanently stained with grease and blood. His eyes were sunken. One night, deep in the Manchurian wilderness, the Thomas Flyer was chugging along a narrow track when the headlights caught a pair of eyes. Then another. Then 10 pairs. Wolves. Not the shy wolves of storybooks, but starving Siberian timber wolves. They began to lope alongside the car. The Flyer could only manage about 15 miles per hour on the rough terrain, not fast enough to outrun them. "Get the gun!" Schuster yelled to Miller, the relief driver. Miller grabbed the rifle. The wolves were closing in on the open cockpit. A large male lunged at the running board. Crack! The rifle shot echoed through the taiga. The wolf tumbled into the mud. The pack scattered, but only for a moment. They continued to shadow the car for miles, a constant reminder that in this place, the humans were not the apex predators. The machine was the only thing keeping them alive. If the engine died here, they would be eaten. Chapter 6. The German Trick. As they pushed deeper into Russia, a rivalry bordering on hatred developed between the Americans and the Germans. Lieutenant Koppen, in the German Protoss, was desperate. He knew the Americans had the 15-day handicap allowance. He had to beat them to Paris by more than 2 weeks to claim victory. The Germans began to strip their car of everything non-essential to save weight. They threw away spare parts. They threw away sleeping gear. They even stopped carrying shirts, wearing only their heavy coats. But then, the Americans discovered something suspicious. At a stop in a small Russian village, a local station master mentioned that the gray car, the Protoss, had not driven through the treacherous swamp ahead. "How did they get past?" Schuster asked, communicating through sign language and broken German. The station master pointed to the train tracks. "He put car on train." Schuster was furious. The rules clearly stated the cars had to be driven. Putting the car on a flatbed train car to skip the swamps was cheating. Schuster wired the committee. The committee investigated. The Germans claimed it was a mechanical necessity because their car was broken and they only skipped a small section. The committee penalized the Germans, adding even more time to their handicap. Now, the Germans had to beat the Americans by 30 days to win. But the Germans were physically ahead on the road. They were racing to Moscow. The Americans were days behind, stuck in the mud, their transmission grinding, their tires shredded. It was time for Schuster to push the Thomas Flyer beyond its limits. Chapter 7. The Gears of War. The drive from Omsk to Moscow became a blur of hallucination and adrenaline. The Thomas Flyer was falling apart. The fenders were gone, the headlights were smashed, the seats were rotting from the damp. But the engine, the massive American-made Iron Heart, kept beating. Schuster became a man possessed. He stopped sleeping almost entirely. He drove for 20 hours at a time, chewing on raw coffee beans to stay awake. When the car broke, he fixed it with baling wire and scrap metal found on the roadside. At one point, a gear in the differential sheared off. They were thousands of miles from a spare part. Schuster found a local blacksmith in a tiny Russian hamlet. He didn't speak Russian. The blacksmith didn't speak English. Schuster drew a picture of the gear in the dirt. The blacksmith nodded. Together, using a primitive forge and hammers, they beat a piece of raw steel into a gear. Schuster filed the teeth by hand, his fingers bleeding. He installed it. It fit. They roared off toward the Urals. They crossed the Ural Mountains, the divide between Asia and Europe. The roads improved slightly. They began to see cobblestones. They began to see road signs. They reached Moscow. The crowds were immense, but they didn't stop for champagne. They gassed up and headed for St. Petersburg, then the border of Germany. The irony was not lost on them. They were driving an American car, chasing a German car through Germany. Chapter 8. The Final Sprint. July 1908, Europe. The German Protos arrived in Paris on July 26th. The crowds in Paris went wild. Lieutenant Copen drove his battered truck down the Champs-Élysées, looking like a conquering hero. He drank the wine. He accepted the flowers. He thought he had won. But the world was watching the clock. The Americans were still on the road. They had to arrive within 30 days of the Germans to claim victory. Schuster was in Berlin. The German people, despite rooting for their own car, treated Schuster with awe. They saw the Thomas Flyer, a wreck of mud and rust, and saw the American flag flapping in the wind. They cheered him as he tore through the streets of Berlin. "To Paris!" Schuster screamed over the engine noise. The final leg was a sprint. The roads of Europe were paved. The Flyer could finally open up. They hit 40 miles per hour, then 50. They crossed the French border. They didn't stop to eat. They ate bread and cheese while driving. On July 30th, 1908, 4 days after the Germans, the Thomas Flyer entered Paris. It was night. The city of lights was glowing. A gendarme on a bicycle spotted the car. "Les Américains! Les Américains!" he shouted. He blew his whistle, clearing traffic. A police escort formed spontaneously. The Thomas Flyer, caked in the mud of 3 continents, smelling of the Siberian swamp, rattled down the boulevards. They pulled up in front of the office of Le Matin. George Schuster killed the engine. For a moment, there was silence. The machine that had run for 169 days, covering 22,000 miles, shuddered and went still. Then the crowd broke the barricades. Epilogue. The winner. The mathematicians did the work. The Germans had arrived first physically, but they had cheated by using the train, and they had skipped the Alaska detour. The Americans had driven the full route. They had arrived only 4 days after the Germans, well within the 30-day allowance. The United States was declared the winner. George Schuster, the mechanic from Buffalo, had done the impossible. He had driven a primitive automobile around the world. He had outlasted aristocrats, soldiers, and wolves. He climbed out of the car. He was deaf from the engine noise. He had lost 20 pounds. He looked like a ghost. But as the crowd lifted him onto their shoulders, he managed a tired smile. The Thomas Flyer was shipped back to New York. It was driven to the White House, where President Teddy Roosevelt, the man who embodied the strenuous life, came out to inspect it. "I like the look of her," Roosevelt said, patting the mud-caked hood. "She looks like she's been somewhere." It was the high-water mark of the early automotive age. The race proved that the car was not a toy. It was a machine that could conquer the world. It paved the way for the highways, the gas stations, and the freedom of the road that would define the American century. And it all happened because a few men were crazy enough to look at a map of the world and say, "I bet I can drive that." Chapter 9. The End of Civilization. March 1908. Western Nebraska. The transition was not subtle. One moment, the Thomas Flyer was battling the sticky gumbo of Iowa, where civilization still existed in the form of farmhouses and telephone poles. The next, they crossed the 100th meridian, and the world simply emptied. The Great Plains stretched out like a frozen ocean of brown grass and white ice. The wind here didn't just blow, it screamed. It came down from the Canadian Shield, unimpeded by trees or hills, hitting the open cockpit of the flyer with the force of a physical blow. George Schuster, huddled in the mechanic's seat, checked the thermometer. It was 20 degrees below zero. The roads had disappeared entirely. The maps they had purchased in New York were now laughable pieces of fiction. They showed towns that were actually just water towers for the steam trains. They showed highways that were nothing more than buffalo trails used by the cattle drives of the 1880s. "Follow the iron," Montague Roberts shouted over the wind. They hugged the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. It was their only lifeline. If they strayed too far from the tracks, they would be lost in a landscape so featureless that men had been known to walk in circles until they froze to death. But following the tracks presented a new danger: the hobos. The panic of 1907 had decimated the American economy. Thousands of men were out of work, drifting west on the rails looking for jobs. They camped in jungle camps along the tracks. When the Thomas Flyer, a $4,000 machine, an astronomical sum, rolled past these camps, it was like a spaceship landing in the Dark Ages. Schuster kept his hand on the Colt revolver in his lap. In North Platte, a group of men tried to block the road with railroad ties, hoping to stop the car and strip it for supplies. Roberts gunned the engine, swerving around the blockade into a ditch, the wheels spraying frozen mud, leaving the bandits cursing in the exhaust smoke. They weren't just racing the Germans anymore. They were racing the collapse of society. Chapter 10. The Wyoming Winch. Wyoming was not a state. It was a test of God. The snow was no longer the soft, wet flakes of New York. It was hard, granular ice packed into drifts 10 feet high by the relentless wind. The flyer, heavy and low to the ground, was essentially a snowplow. Schuster developed a system that was agonizing in its slowness. When they hit a drift that the car couldn't ram through, which was every few hundred yards, they couldn't just back up. The reverse gear was too weak. They had to use the block and tackle. Schuster would jump out into the waist-deep snow. He would take a heavy iron spike and a sledgehammer and walk 50 feet ahead of the car. He would drive the spike into the frozen permafrost. He would attach a pulley system to the spike and the front axle of the car. The crew would then hand-crank the winch, dragging the 5,000-pound car forward, inch by painful inch, over the snowdrift. Once over, they would pack up the gear, drive 50 feet, hit the next drift, and do it all again. They did this for days. In the red desert of Wyoming, the wind was so loud they had to communicate by hand signals. Their lips cracked and bled. Their faces were black with frostbite and grease. One night near Rock Springs, the flyer slid sideways off an icy ridge. It hung precariously over a ravine, teetering on 2 wheels. "Don't move," Schuster commanded. The slightest shift in weight would send the car tumbling into the darkness. Schuster, moving with the slow deliberation of a man who has accepted death, crawled out the uphill side. He grabbed a rope and tied it to the chassis, then tied the other end to his own waist. He dug his heels into the ice, acting as a human anchor, while Roberts gently, terrifyingly, reversed the wheels to gain traction. They survived by inches. That night, they didn't set up tents. They slept in the car, huddled together for warmth, listening to the coyotes howl at the intrusion of the machine.
Chapter 11. The Cowboy Escort. As they approached the Continental Divide, the race had captured the imagination of the Westerners. The telegraph lines were buzzing. "The New York car is coming." In a scene that felt like a collision of 2 centuries, the Thomas Flyer was met outside of Cheyenne by a posse of cowboys. These were men who had ridden the open range, men who viewed automobiles as devil wagons. But they respected grit, and they saw that the men in the Flyer were tougher than the iron they rode in. "You boys need a path?" the lead cowboy shouted, his horse rearing at the smell of gasoline. The cowboys formed a flying V ahead of the car. They used their lariats to drag logs out of the way. When the snow got too deep for the car, the horses trampled a path, packing the snow down into a hard surface the tires could grip. For 50 miles, the 20th century was pulled forward by the 19th. It was during this leg that the French de Dion car, miles behind, began to fall apart. The French crew, accustomed to the boulevards of Paris, looked at the Rocky Mountains and wept. They were selling their supplies to buy food. The Italian Zust was suffering even worse. Their crew had resorted to drinking the car's radiator alcohol to stay warm, leading to a drunken crash into a snowbank that cost them 2 days. But the Americans had George Schuster. He was fixing the radiator with oatmeal. The starch plugged the leaks, and wrapping the tires in rope to act as primitive chains. He was MacGyver 70 years before the TV show. Chapter 12. The Ghosts of Rhyolite. After the freezing hell of the Rockies came the terrifying silence of the Great Basin, Nevada. They dropped from the snowy peaks into the high desert. The temperature swung violently. The mud turned to dust, alkali dust that coated their lungs and choked the carburetor. They rolled into the town of Rhyolite, Nevada. In 1908, Rhyolite was a booming gold rush town, full of prospectors, gamblers, and women of the night. Today, it is one of the most famous ghost towns in America. The arrival of the flyer was the biggest event since the gold strike. The miners emerged from the saloons, blinking in the sunlight. They touched the car as if it were a religious artifact. "You going to Death Valley?" one prospector with one eye asked Schuster. "We have to. It's the only way to the Sierras." The prospector spat tobacco juice on the dusty tire. "You'll leave your bones there. No water, and that machine will boil like a tea kettle." He wasn't wrong. As they entered the Death Valley region, the heat became an enemy as formidable as the cold. The Thomas Flyer was water-cooled. In the desert, the water evaporated almost instantly. They ran out of water on the second day. The engine temperature gauge redlined. Steam hissed violently from the cap. Schuster looked at the canteen. Empty. He looked at the map. 20 miles to the next well. He looked at the wine. The citizens of Rhyolite had gifted them several bottles of champagne and red wine for the journey. Schuster didn't hesitate. He uncorked the vintage bottles and poured the wine into the radiator. The Thomas Flyer, now running on a mixture of water and Pinot Noir, smelled like a boiling winery as it chugged through the sand. The alcohol fumes made the crew dizzy, but the engine temperature dropped just enough to keep the pistons from seizing. They limped into Goldfield, Nevada, drunk on fumes, but alive. Chapter 13. The Mutiny. It was in the deserts of Nevada that the human element began to crack. Montague Roberts, the primary driver, was exhausted. He was a race car driver, a man of speed, not a survivalist. The endless digging, the freezing nights, and the gnawing hunger had broken his spirit. He announced he was leaving the race at San Francisco. This was a disaster. The race rules required 2 men in the car at all times. If Roberts left, Schuster would be alone with Miller, the relief driver. But Miller wasn't a mechanic. Schuster realized that from this point on, he would have to drive. He wasn't just the mechanic anymore. He was the commander. "You go home, Monty," Schuster said, his voice raspy from the dust. "I'll take her to Paris." There was no ceremony. The glamour was gone. It was just a job now. A job that required driving across an ocean of ice. Chapter 14. The Pacific. March 24th, 1908, San Francisco. Reaching the Pacific Ocean felt like reaching the moon. They had crossed the continent in 41 days, 8 hours, and 15 minutes. It was a transcontinental record.
The car looked like it had been through a war. The gray paint was gone, sandblasted away by the wind, the leather seats were torn, the fenders were held on by wire. San Francisco was still recovering from the great earthquake of 1906. The city was a mix of ruins and reconstruction. But when the Thomas Flyer rolled down Market Street, the city stopped rebuilding to cheer. Thousands lined the streets, women threw flowers, men threw hats. But George Schuster didn't wave. He was looking at the harbor. He was looking at the ship that would take them to Alaska. He knew something the cheering crowds didn't know. He knew that the American West, with its cowboys and railroad tracks, was the easy part. Ahead of him was the Bering Strait. Ahead of him lay Siberia. Schuster patted the steering wheel of the Flyer. "Rest up, old girl," he whispered. "The wolves are waiting." Interlude: The Lost Days of Alaska. As mentioned in Part 1, the Alaska leg was a fiasco. But the details of that fiasco are worth noting for the sheer absurdity of the attempt. When the cars arrived in Valdez, Alaska, the road they were promised was covered in 12 feet of snow. The citizens of Valdez, desperate for the publicity, tried to convince Schuster to drive anyway. "It's just a little soft," the mayor of Valdez told him. Schuster walked out onto the trail. He took a step and sank to his chest. He looked at the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, we brought a car, not a submarine." The decision to turn back was heartbreaking. It meant retracing their steps by sea to Seattle. It meant losing weeks of time. It was during this boat ride back south that the German team, the Protos, made their move. While the Americans were playing tourist in Alaska, the Germans had sailed directly to Vladivostok. They were already in Russia. They were ahead. The race had shifted from a physical challenge to a desperate game of catch-up.
Chapter 15. The Land of the Rising Sun. May 1908. Tsuruga, Japan. The Thomas Flyer arrived in Japan like a monster from another dimension. To the villagers of the Japanese countryside, who lived in a society that had only recently opened to the West, the automobile was a terrifying curiosity. The Flyer was loud, it smelled of chemical fire, and it moved without horses. The roads of Japan were picturesque, winding through rice paddies and ancient cedar forests. They were beautiful. They were also 4 feet wide. They were designed for rickshaws and pedestrians, not a 5,000-pound American touring car. George Schuster sat behind the wheel, sweat stinging his eyes. This wasn't the brute force driving of the Rockies, this was surgical precision. The wheels of the Flyer hung over the edges of the narrow dikes that separated the rice fields. 1 inch to the left, and the car would roll into the muck. 1 inch to the right, and they would crush a farmer's crop. Then came the bridges. Japan was a land of rivers, spanned by delicate, high-arching bamboo bridges. They were works of art. They were not, however, load-bearing structures for heavy machinery. At one river crossing, Schuster got out and walked the bridge. It swayed under his own weight. He looked at the rushing water below. He looked at the car. "Lighten the load," he ordered. They stripped everything out of the car. Spare tires, tools, luggage, gasoline cans. It all had to be carried across by hand. Then Schuster got in. He didn't rev the engine. He let it idle forward in first gear, creeping onto the bamboo. Creak. Snap. The bamboo groaned. The bridge bowed in the center, dipping perilously toward the water. The tires depressed the wood so deeply it looked like the bridge would snap like a dry twig. Schuster held his breath, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at the drop. When the front wheels hit solid ground on the other side, he didn't cheer. He just wiped his face with a rag and signaled for the crew to reload. They had to do this hundreds of times. Japan was a test of patience, but it was a paradise compared to what was waiting across the Sea of Japan. Chapter 16. The Gates of Hell. May 18, 1908, Vladivostok, Russia. Vladivostok was the wild east of the Tsar's empire. It was a city of mud, soldiers, and spies, teeming with the tension of the recently lost Russo-Japanese War. When the Thomas Flyer was craned off the ship onto the Russian dock, the reality of the situation hit the crew like a sledgehammer. The German team, Protos, and the Italian team, Zust, had already been there. They had a head start. But more importantly, the roads marked on the Russian military maps simply did not exist. The governor of Vladivostok looked at the American car and laughed. He said, "You cannot drive to Paris. There are no roads in Siberia, only the taiga and the treks." Schuster realized the governor was right. The spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, had turned the landscape into a swamp the size of the United States. Schuster made a radical decision. He turned the Thomas Flyer into a tank. He went to a local blacksmith. He stripped the beautiful curving fenders off the car. They would only get clogged with mud. He cut away the running boards. He installed heavier springs. Then he looked at the transmission. The gears were already worn from the American crossing. He had no spares. He was about to drive 8,000 miles across a wasteland with a transmission held together by hope and shellac. "If we break down here," Schuster told the crew, "we stay here. There is no rescue."
Chapter 17. The Manchurian Swamp. They crossed into Manchuria, a lawless buffer zone between Russia and China. The mud here was different. In Iowa, it was sticky gumbo. In Siberia, it was a bottomless black soup. The car didn't get stuck occasionally, it was stuck permanently. The method of travel shifted from driving to winching. Schuster would wade into the swamp, carrying the heavy iron anchor. The mosquitoes were so thick they formed black clouds around his head. They bit through his leather gloves. They bit through his canvas jacket. The men's eyes swelled shut from the bites. They would crank the winch. The car would slide 10 feet, the chassis dragging through the mud like a boat haul. Crank, slide, stop. Crank, slide, stop. They averaged 10 miles a day. They were awake for 20 hours a day. They ate canned beans, cold, because stopping to build a fire took too much energy. And they were not alone. Manchuria was infested with Hunghuts, the Redbeards. These were Chinese bandits, warlords who roamed the countryside looting and killing. The Thomas Flyer, gleaming with brass and loaded with supplies, was the richest prize to ever enter their territory. Schuster kept the Winchester rifle across his lap at all times. One evening, as the sun set blood red over the swamp, a group of horsemen appeared on the ridgeline. They watched the car struggling in the mud. They didn't attack. They just watched. "Don't look at them," Schuster hissed to Miller. "Keep cranking." The bandits, perhaps confused by the strange, noisy machine, or perhaps waiting for nightfall, eventually turned and rode away. The Americans didn't sleep that night. They sat back to back in the open car, rifles cocked, listening to the swamp gurgle. Chapter 18. The Tunnel of Death. The mud eventually became impassable. Even the winch couldn't pull them through the liquid earth. Schuster looked at the Trans-Siberian Railroad embankment. It was raised above the swamp. It was dry. "We go on the tracks," Schuster said. It was illegal. It was dangerous, but it was the only way. For hundreds of miles, the Thomas Flyer straddled the rails of the Trans-Siberian. It was a bone-jarring nightmare. Thump, 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 thump. The spacing of the railroad ties didn't match the car's wheelbase perfectly. The car bucked and slammed violently every second. Bolts sheared off. The radiator cracked again. The crew's kidneys felt like they were bleeding. Then came the tunnels. Siberian train tunnels were cut through solid granite. They were narrow, dark and unventilated. Schuster drove the car into a mile-long tunnel near Lake Baikal. It was pitch black. The headlights cut a weak beam into the soot-filled air. Halfway through, they heard it. Whoo! Whistle. Absolute panic. "Reverse!" Miller screamed. "No time!" Schuster yelled. "Get it off!" They were deep in the tunnel. There was barely room to stand next to the tracks, let alone park a car. Schuster spotted a small cutout in the rock wall, a safety alcove for track workers. He jammed the car into the alcove. The front left wheel hung over the rail. The ground began to shake. The roar of the steam locomotive became deafening. The headlight of the train appeared around the curve like an angry star. The crew pressed themselves against the cold, wet rock wall. Schuster grabbed the front of the car and physically heaved, his muscles tearing, trying to shove the heavy iron beast just 2 inches further into the alcove. The train roared past. It was a wall of noise and heat. The steam blast seared their faces. The wind of the passing train sucked at their clothes, threatening to pull them under the wheels. The clearance was so tight that the train's pistons missed the Thomas Flyer's fender by less than an inch. Then silence. Just the ringing in their ears and the smell of coal smoke. Schuster slumped against the rock. He checked the car. It was untouched. He said, "Let's go before the next one comes."
Chapter 19. The Lost Gasoline. Deep in Siberia, the greatest enemy wasn't the terrain, it was logistics. There were no gas stations in 1908. The race organizers had arranged for the Nobel Brothers Oil Company, the Russian oil monopoly, to drop barrels of fuel at train stations along the route. But Russia was vast, and communication was poor. They arrived at a remote station near Irkutsk, running on fumes. Schuster found the station master. "Benzene?" Schuster asked, using the word for gasoline. The station master shrugged. "Niet." The fuel hadn't arrived, or it had been stolen, or it had never been sent. They were stranded, 500 miles from the next city. Schuster began to scavenge. He went into the village. He found a pharmacy. He bought all their rubbing alcohol. He found a dry cleaner. He bought their cleaning fluid. He found a wealthy merchant who had a kerosene lamp. He mixed a witch's brew of alcohol, kerosene, and cleaning solvent. He poured it into the tank. The engine sputtered. It coughed. It backfired so loudly it sounded like a cannon shot. But it ran. The Thomas Flyer limped toward Irkutsk, trailing a cloud of black, acrid smoke that smelled like a chemical factory fire. The engine knocked violently, protesting the abuse, but the American iron held. Chapter 20. The Prince and the Pauper. It was in Russia that the team dynamic shifted again. The New York Times had sent a reporter to join them, and the Russian government had assigned a military observer. Suddenly, the car was crowded, and the class divide was sharp. George Schuster was a working-class mechanic. He was dirty, greasy, and practical. The new passengers were men of status. They expected to be driven. They didn't want to push. One afternoon, the car sank into a particularly deep mud hole. Schuster jumped out, grabbing the shovel. "Dig," he told the Russian observer. The observer looked at his pristine uniform. "I am an officer of the Tsar. I do not dig." Schuster, exhausted, starving, and pushed to the brink of insanity, walked up to the officer. He was holding a heavy wrench. "In this car," Schuster said, his voice low and dangerous, "there are no officers. There are only engines and shovels. If you don't dig, you walk to Paris." The officer looked at Schuster's eyes. He saw the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had fought wolves and blizzards.
The officer grabbed a shovel.
They dug together, and in the mud of Siberia, a strange respect formed. They were no longer Americans or Russians. They were the crew of the flyer. Chapter 21. The Phantom Lead. June 1908. They reached Omsk. They reached the Ural Mountains. They were making incredible time now, covering 150 miles a day on the hardening roads. But they had no idea where the Germans were. There was no radio. The telegraph lines were unreliable. For all they knew, the Germans were already in Paris. Or maybe the Germans had broken down weeks ago. The psychological torture was worse than the physical pain. Were they pushing this hard for nothing? In Perm, a telegraph finally reached them. It was from the race committee. Protos passed through Kazan 3 days ago. 3 days. The Germans were physically ahead, but the 15-day handicap, penalty, meant the Americans were technically leading. If they could just maintain this gap, if they could just keep the Germans within 2 weeks of them, they would win. But the hardest part of the car was failing. The transmission gear, the one Schuster had repaired in the U.S., was stripping again. It slipped out of gear constantly. Schuster had to drive with one hand on the wheel and one forcibly holding the gear lever in place, fighting the vibration that tried to shatter his arm. He couldn't stop to fix it. To stop was to lose. They crossed the border into European Russia. The golden domes of Moscow appeared on the horizon. Civilization. But civilization brought its own problems. The roads were now paved with cobblestones. For a car with no suspension to speak of, cobblestones were torture. The vibration was so intense that the headlights simply fell off. The fenders, what was left of them, rattled loose. They roared into Moscow, a battered, broken, smoking wreck of a vehicle. They didn't look like winners. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck. But as they pulled into Red Square, George Schuster saw something that made him forget the pain. He saw a newspaper. And on the front page, a headline, "The Americans are coming." The world was watching. The impossible race was about to have a photo finish.
Chapter 22. The Cobblestone Hell. July 1908. European Russia. Leaving Moscow felt like waking up from a nightmare, only to realize you hadn't slept in months. The roads were no longer swamps, but they offered a new kind of torture: cobblestones. The Russian military roads leading to St. Petersburg were paved with round, uneven stones. For a modern car with shock absorbers, this is bumpy. For the 1907 Thomas Flyer, whose suspension springs were either broken or stiffened with rust, it was like driving inside a cement mixer. The vibration was so intense that it blurred their vision. Bolts that hadn't shaken loose in the Rockies or Siberia now simply sheared off. George Schuster had to develop a new driving technique. The transmission was failing. The gear shift lever refused to stay in high gear. If he let go, it would pop into neutral. So Schuster drove with his left hand on the wheel and his right arm locked rigid against the gear lever, forcing it into place. He drove like this for hundreds of miles. His shoulder bruised, then went numb. The physical agony was constant. "Just hold together," he pleaded with the machine. "Just a little further." They reached St. Petersburg on July 4th, Independence Day. But there were no fireworks for them. They spent the holiday in a garage, welding the chassis, which had developed a hairline fracture. They were exhausted, they were starving, but they were fast. On the better roads, they were now averaging 200 miles a day. They were hunting. Chapter 23. Into the Lion's Den. July 1908. The German border. Crossing into Germany was a moment of high anxiety. The German car, the Protos, was currently in the lead physically. It was racing toward Berlin, the German capital. The national pride of the German Empire was at stake. The Kaiser himself was following the race. Schuster expected hostility. He was driving the American Challenger through the competitor's homeland. Instead, they found something remarkable. As the Thomas Flyer roared through the pristine, tree-lined avenues of East Prussia, German villagers lined the roads. They didn't jeer, they cheered. They threw flowers. To the German public, the politics didn't matter as much as the machine. They saw the American car, this battered gray ghost that had crossed Siberia, and they recognized the engineering feat. They arrived in Berlin just days after the Protos had passed through. The reception was deafening. The streets were packed with Berliners shouting, "Hoch! Hoch! Hooray!" But Schuster didn't stop for long. He knew the math. The Protos had arrived in Paris on July 26th. The clock was ticking. The Americans had a 30-day allowance, 15 days for the Alaska detour, and 15 days for the German train penalty. If the Americans arrived before August 25th, they would win. But Schuster didn't just want to win on paper. He wanted to make it close. He wanted to prove that even without the penalty, the American car was superior. He said, "To Paris," turning the crank one last time in Berlin, non-stop.
Chapter 24. The Champagne Sprint. The final 600 miles were a blur. Germany gave way to Belgium. Belgium gave way to France. The roads were paved macadam, smooth, hard, fast. The Thomas Flyer, relieved of the mud and the snow, seemed to sense the end. The engine sang. They hit 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. Schuster hadn't slept in 48 hours. He was hallucinating. The trees lining the French roads looked like people. The shadows looked like wolves. To keep him awake, the crew fed him coffee and small sips of champagne, the only fuel they had left for the humans. They tore through the French countryside. Farmers stopped their plows to watch the gray streak pass. They knew who it was. The telegraphs had told them. L'Américain was coming. Chapter 25. The Finish Line. July 30th, 1908, 8 p.m., Paris. Dusk was settling over the city of light. The gas lamps were flickering on along the boulevards. On the outskirts of the city, a gendarme on a bicycle heard a roar. He looked up and saw a car that looked like it had been chewed up by the earth itself. It had no headlights, they were smashed. It had no windshield. It was caked in layers of dirt that contained the soil of 3 continents. The gendarme blew his whistle. "Suivez-moi! Follow me!" A spontaneous procession formed. Bicycles, other cars, and running children surrounded the flyer. They turned onto the Grand Boulevards. The crowds were immense. People spilled out of cafes, wine glasses in hand. They climbed onto lampposts. They shouted, "Vive l'Amérique!" Georges Schuster, his face black with grease, his eyes red-rimmed and sunken, gripped the wheel. He steered the car toward the office of Le Matin, the newspaper that had started it all. At exactly 8 p.m., the Thomas Flyer ground to a halt. Schuster cut the engine. Silence. Then the crowd broke the police line. They swarmed the car. They pulled Schuster and the crew out of the seats. They lifted them into the air. Someone shoved a magnum of champagne into Schuster's grease-stained hand. He took a drink. It tasted like victory. They had done it. 169 days, 22,000 miles, New York to Paris. The long way round.
Chapter 26. The Verdict. The celebration lasted for days, but the official verdict took a moment of calculation. The German Protos arrived in Paris on July 26th. The American Thomas Flyer arrived on July 30th, 4 days later. The handicap? The Americans had a 30-day credit due to the race committee's erratic route changes and the German penalty for using the train. The result? The United States won the race by 26 days. It was a crushing victory. Lieutenant Koppen, the German driver, was a gentleman. He congratulated the Americans warmly. He knew what they had been through. He knew that out in the Siberian mud, rank and nationality didn't matter. Only the engine mattered. The French, who had no cars finish the race, the Dion had retired in Russia, were nonetheless gracious hosts. The Americans were toasted as the new kings of the road. George Schuster sent a telegram to the Thomas factory in Buffalo, NY. It was short and typical of the man. Arrived Paris. Car in good shape. Schuster. Epilogue. The Long Shadow. 1908 to 1964. The race changed the world, but it almost destroyed the winners. The E.R. Thomas Motor Company enjoyed a brief surge in sales, but they made a fatal mistake. They didn't adapt to the assembly line methods of Henry Ford. The company went bankrupt just a few years later. The greatest car in the world ceased to exist. The Thomas Flyer itself, the hero car, was brought back to the U.S. and paraded before President Theodore Roosevelt. But then it was forgotten. It was sold to a junkyard. For decades, the car that conquered the world sat rotting in a barn, chickens roosting on its seats. And George Schuster? He went back to work. He didn't seek fame. He was a mechanic. He lived a quiet life in upstate New York. But in 1964, a miracle happened. William Harrah, the casino mogul and car collector, found the Thomas Flyer. It was a wreck. He bought it and brought it to Reno, Nevada. He needed someone to verify it. He needed someone who knew every bolt, every repair, every scar on the chassis. They found George Schuster. He was 91 years old. They flew him to Reno. The old man, frail and nearly blind, walked up to the rusted heap of metal. He ran his hands over the frame. He reached under the chassis and felt for a specific weld, the one he had made in a Russian blacksmith shop in the middle of the night 56 years ago. He found it. "This is her," Schuster whispered, tears streaming down his face. "This is the Flyer." He helped them restore it. He watched them bring it back to its former glory. And shortly after seeing his old friend run one last time, George Schuster passed away. Today, the Thomas Flyer sits in the National Automobile Museum in Reno, Nevada. It is pristine, but if you look closely, you can still see the cracks in the frame. You can see the scars of the Rockies and the dents from the Siberian stones. It stands as a silent monument to a time when men were made of iron and cars were made of dreams. The end.